Welcome to this technical how-to video. My name is Kelly Campbell. I look after Protecht ERM online help. This video will help you get started with using Protecht ERM REST APIs, which help you automate tasks and do more in less time by integrating with the systems you're already using. So here's a quick breakdown of what this video will cover. First, we'll look at how you access the API reference docs for information about operations, then how to identify your API base URL. Next, we'll go through authentication and setting up your API access, then sending a request and using the response data to perform a second request. Before we begin, there are some prerequisites to performing these tasks. To get the most out of this video, you should have some knowledge and experience in web development, coding, HTTP requests, and REST best practices. There is plenty of information and training materials available online if you'd like to learn more on these topics before you get started. The examples we're going to use in this video will allow us to add a role to a user by first getting a list of users in the system and then using some of the data in that list to update a user record. The first step is to take a look at the API reference documentation. This documentation contains information about API operations, including any parameters that they require or that are available to use, and examples for the request data and response data, so you can see what kind of data you can expect to get back from that operation. To access the API reference documentation, you need to have the permission to view web API docs in one of the roles assigned to you. You can check this by viewing your user account and looking at the Permissions tab. If you have that permission, you can open the documentation by going to the Help menu and selecting API documentation. If you can't see that option, you don't have the View Web API Docs permission. The reference documentation lists each of the different API resources available for different types of records in the system. Click on the one that interests you, and then you'll see a list of its operations showing the request method, endpoint path, and title for each one. Click on an operation to see a full description and a listing of the parameters. Here's the first of the examples we're going to use, get a list of users. This particular example doesn't have any required parameters because we're just getting a list of users. But there are optional parameters that you can use to filter the results, and it's really a good idea to use these because a list of all users in the system could be very large. Generally, our APIs return a maximum of 50 records, so you're likely to need to use one or more of these parameters. This page will give you all of the information about what they are and how you can use them. If you scroll down, you'll see an example of the type of data that is returned by the operation, and the model is expandable, so you just click on the little chevrons to open up to different levels, and you can see here the user object model that will be returned from this operation. Next, we're going to identify the API base URL, which is specific to your Protecht ERM system. This is easy to find. It's displayed at the top of your API reference documentation. Yours should look something like the example on screen, which has some of the specific details blurred out. You can copy that and save it somewhere for building a request URL. Every request to our APIs requires basic authentication. That means that your request header must include a security token from a Protecht ERM user account that has access to the relevant business units required to access the data that you're looking for. It needs to have permissions to perform API calls, and it needs permissions to perform the operations in the system that you want to complete using the API. As a security precaution, we recommend giving the API user account only the permissions required to perform the operation, rather than giving it a blanket high-level administrative role. For even better security, you should create different API user accounts for performing different operations. To set up that kind of account, we're going to create an API request role first. In the Roles and Permissions module, create a new role and give it a name that makes sense for the purpose of the role. Then you need to select full user permissions to be able to access the right permissions for API operations. In the Permissions section, expand the administration group and select the permissions highlighted here, API Documentation View and also Web Services Access. Then you want to add to that the permissions for the actions that you want to perform using this account. So in this case, we're going to be performing operations with the users library. So I'll select the relevant permissions for that and then save the role. Next, create the API user account. Go to the users library and click Create New. Again, give the user a name that reflects the purpose of this user account. Next, select the level of business units that will provide access to the data you need, and then add the API role that you just created. Now save that user, and once it's saved, we can go back up to the security token field, click the View button at the end, and that's the security token that you'll need in the next step, along with the username for this account. To send a request, we first need to check the API reference docs for information about the operation and its parameters. So scrolling down to the user's API, expand that, note the request method and endpoint path for the operation you want to use, and then expand the operation. We'll go through this example twice, once building the request using the command line tool curl, and then again using the try it out feature here in the reference documentation. To build the request URL, add the operation endpoint to your API base URL. Here's how that looks in curl. Next, add the request method, which indicates what kind of action we're performing, and in this case, it's post. Next, we need to add our security token to the request header. This is the security token from the user account, not the password. Finally, add any required or optional parameters to the URL as path or query parameters. This operation doesn't have any required parameters, but I am going to add the offset and limit parameters, which will help me to page through the users in the system to allow me to get to the user that I'm looking for. So just as an example, I'm specifying a limit of 2 users in the response data and an offset of 10, which tells the API to skip the first 10 records and then just give me the next 2 records in the results. If you wanted to search for a specific user, you'd probably use the filter context rest parameter instead. Now let's see how you can do it using the try it out feature. This is available within the API reference documentation, and it's a great way to check out how the APIs work if you aren't ready to build your request in curl or use an API platform such as Postman. Bear in mind that this is a real API call and will change real data in your system if you are using one of the operations that changes data. Click Try It Out here under the operation description, and then you can add your parameter data underneath. So here, for the filter context rest parameter, I don't want to include anything, so I'm just going to delete that data and then scroll down to the parameters I want to use, which is limit and offset. You can just update the default values there, and then click Execute. Now here is where we add our authentication. So I'm going to put in the API user username and the security token for that account, not the password. If your request is successful, the response will be returned on screen here. We can see the request that was sent, and the response code is 200, which means it was successful. The data is provided in JSON format with a download button at the bottom, so you can save and manipulate that data. The API has several endpoints that each perform specific actions, so you can chain them together to perform a more complex action. We've just performed the action to get a list of users, which gives us the user data, and now we can use that data to update a user so we can assign a new role to them. The second operation we need to do this is a put operation, update a user. We can review what's required here in the documentation, and then we can take the data from the JSON file that we just downloaded and just copy and paste that into the value here. Now what we're going to do is add a role, and that means I need the role ID and name in the format that's used here. Now I could use another API operation to do that, one that returns a list of roles, for example. I have that information prepared already, and all I need to do is add it to the roles array here. So we are adding the mobile app access role to this user. We also need to add the user ID, which is actually available right here in the JSON data. So we can copy it from there and paste it straight into that field and click execute. We've already authenticated by using the previous operation, of course, and here's our result. We've got a code 200. That's good, that means it's successful. And then what is returned is the current value of the user in the system. So we can check that to confirm that yes, the role that I included has been added to the user's account. You can also double check on the UI by opening the user record and yes, he does indeed now have mobile access.